Hello, everyone. My name is Jamal Williams, and I'm currently a PhD student at Princeton, working with Kenneth Norman, Elizabeth Margulis, and Ori Hassan. And today I'll be talking to you about the neural mechanisms underlying event cognition for real-world music. I want to start off by asking a question. How do we extract high-level meaning from continuous experience? Let me give a brief example of how we might go about doing this. In the process of making it to this conference, you likely had to carry out a sequence of steps in order to get here. That might have gone a little something like this. First, you probably prepared for your trip. Next, you made it to the airport to catch your flight. Then you flew from your respective city for several hours and eventually made it to Crete, unlike me. Although subjectively you experience these events as occurring continuously over time, your brain's possibly segmented these events into discrete chunks, each chunk consisting of their own set of sub-events. Together, these long and short events exist along a nested hierarchy in which the shorter event representations are combined to build longer event representations. In one study designed to test this hypothesis, people were asked to watch an episode of the TV series Sherlock while undergoing fMRI scanning. To test the hypothesis that events from the episode were segmented along a cortical processing hierarchy, Baldessano et al. Used a hidden Markov model to segment the neural time series across a range of ROIs, with a goal of determining the preferred timescale of segmentation for each ROI. To explain how the model works, say that we have a set of time courses from a group of voxels within an ROI. The model will attempt to estimate an average event pattern corresponding to discrete periods of stable neural activity punctuated by shifts between them. The model will iteratively test these estimates against the true data until the estimated event patterns best explain the data. More specifically, if we define a set of K events, in this example, we have 3 events, we can ask how well the model generates a set of brain responses. Some important constraints on the model are that it must start in K equals 1, and it must end in final state K. Furthermore, for each time point, the model can either remain in the same state or move to the next state. Therefore, it's not permitted to return to any previous states. A brain response is included in a particular state based on its similarity to the average event pattern, M sub K, generated by the model. When this model was applied to the Sherlock movie watching brain data, the model preferred to segment the time courses in the purple regions into short-lasting chunks corresponding to fast-changing information occurring in the episode, possibly things like movement or changes in audio amplitude. The time point by time point similarity matrix here reads from bottom left to top right, and the model fits are being shown as the white dotted lines. Yellow blocks can be thought of as sustained periods of neural activity. Alternatively, the regions in orange are where the model preferred to segment the time courses into long-lasting chunks, presumably corresponding to changes in plot or narrative. These areas roughly overlap with parts of the default mode network and are suspected to inherit short timescale information from sensory areas in order to construct more meaningful event representations that tend to correspond to behaviorally defined event boundaries and events. In Lerdahl and Jackendorf's generative theory of tonal music, they propose that the temporal structure of music undergoes hierarchical processing as well, such that songs are composed of sections, sections are composed of phrases, and phrases are composed of motifs. Additionally, they propose that within each stage of the hierarchy, music uses periods of relative stability and instability to evoke feelings of tension and relaxation between events. This may result in narrative and/or emotional changes experienced by the listener. They also propose that chunking of these events are derived from changes in the acoustic properties of music, such as changes in meter, timbre, and tonality. And these chunking principles may be ubiquitous across cognitive systems, although the specific principles may differ in certain ways between cognitive processes, such as vision or audition. This takes me to my primary research questions. First, do the recent findings on event cognition for narrative-based stimuli extend to event cognition in the domain of music? Specifically, does the cortical processing hierarchy for music resemble that found in prior work such that low-level brain areas process information occurring over short time scales, and higher order brain areas represent more meaningful event structure occurring over longer time scales. To address these questions, we ran a study whereby we had 25 participants passively listen to 16 songs while undergoing fMRI scanning, where half of these songs were classical and the other half were jazz. We then had a separate group of non-fMRI participants listen to each song with the task of pressing a space bar every time they felt that a meaningful change occurred within each excerpt. From this, we then calculated consensus boundaries across all 7 participants to acquire unique sets of event boundary locations within each piece. The steps we performed for our analysis were as follows. First, we extracted neural activity patterns from a given brain area for each subject. Here, each rectangle represents a neural activity time series for each subject within a given song. Each row corresponds to an individual voxel, and each column corresponds to a neural activity measurement at each time step of the excerpt. Next, we average all of the subjects' data together into a single neural time series. And finally, for each excerpt, we compared the locations of the boundaries provided by the non-fMRI participants, here shown in black, to the locations of the boundaries detected by the HMM, shown here as the white dotted lines. As a reminder, the model seeks to segment the neural time series into chunks characterized by periods of relative stability with boundaries between those periods, or those stable periods. Furthermore, we do not inform the model of where these boundaries are in the data. Rather, it determines the locations of these boundaries in an unsupervised manner. If a model boundary and a human annotation fell within 3 seconds of each other, we would consider that to be a match, as indicated by the downward arrows. If we compute this match score across all of cortex via full brain searchlight method, we can determine which brain areas chunk the excerpts in a similar way to our non-fMRI participants. Our results show that several higher order areas, as well as low-level auditory regions, exhibit boundary structure that closely resembles the human boundaries. These areas are precuneus, angular gyrus, auditory cortex, and MPFC. And here we can see that the boundaries detected in MPFC most closely align with the human boundaries. So next, we wanted to determine whether event boundaries in these brain areas were purely driven by acoustic information, or if they were possibly related to more complex information within the songs. So we reran our analysis, except this time we tried to control for acoustic features, such as features conveying changes in pitch over time, features conveying changes in timbre, and features conveying changes in rhythm or tempo. We then combined these features into a single model and subtracted them from the brain data. Then we reran our analysis comparing the behavioral boundaries to the HMM boundaries, our hypothesis being that boundaries in auditory cortex would no longer match the human boundaries due to its purported role in processing low-level acoustic information, and instead only higher order areas would preserve their event boundary structure. When we reran our analysis, we found that many voxels in higher order areas and auditory areas no longer showed strong matches to the human boundaries. However, we did find that right auditory cortex preserved this boundary structure as well as in MPFC. To a much lesser extent, voxels in precuneus and angular gyrus preserve theirs as well. This suggests that the boundaries in these remaining areas are not purely driven by a simple combination of the acoustic features, but instead that they may be driven by a more complex combination of the acoustic features or other high-level aspects of the music, such as narrative and/or emotional changes. Finally, we wanted to reconcile the finding that auditory cortex, a region well known for processing low-level acoustic information, also represents high-level event structure. So we ran one more analysis to address this discrepancy, in which we allowed the HMM to find as many events as it wanted to in each brain region. This would tell us each brain area's preferred event duration, irrespective of the behavioral boundaries. Here I'm plotting the brain activity over time for auditory cortex, precuneus, MPFC, and angular gyrus. This data comes from participants listening to the first 90 seconds of a particular excerpt. And the black squares are the event locations determined by the non-fMRI annotators. Looking at activity across time for auditory cortex, this time we're reading time from the top left to the bottom right. We can see that the yellow blocks along the diagonal are short, but not visibly that different in length from the block structure in precuneus and angular gyrus. To test this explicitly, we refit the HMM to this data, except this time we allowed the number of events to vary and determine each ROI's preferred event length by comparing the within event correlations to the across event correlations for each K. And the preferred event length was defined as the K that maximized the average within event correlations relative to across event correlations. On this plot, I'm showing the preferred event length in seconds for each brain area. So based on the shapes of these distributions, we can see that auditory cortex, precuneus, and angular gyrus prefer to represent events of a similar length, somewhere between 10 and 20 seconds, which would be considered intermediate to long timescales. On the other hand, MPFC prefers longer events than all three ROIs, ranging from about 15 to 60 seconds. And this is illustrated in its similarity matrix, where we can see long periods of sustained activity. So one reason that auditory cortex's preferred event length may not differ from precuneus and angular gyrus, which are thought to be long timescale regions, is due to the lag in the bold signal, which may prevent us from observing neural responses in auditory cortex that are shorter than the lag. Furthermore, it is well known that auditory cortex responds reliably to rapid changes in the environment from many other studies that probe its activity with very short audio stimuli. But one novel finding in our study is that auditory cortex may also represent intermediate to long timescale musical events and not just short musical events. So to give an example of how musical event structure is represented in one of our regions of interest, I've prepared an animation showing how activity in cortex changes over time, which again can be read diagonally from top left to bottom right. I'm using activity from MPFC for this example, our ROI with the best matches between the HMM and the behavioral boundaries. The HMM events are denoted by the white squares, and the behavioral events are denoted by the black boxes. One last thing to point out is that we can also see where the human boundaries and the HMM boundaries overlap and where they don't. This suggests that while MPFC has boundaries that match the behavioral annotations, some boundaries in MPFC correspond to different events than the behavioral boundaries. Okay, now to wrap up, I've shown that high-level music event boundaries defined by a group of behavioral participants were detected in higher order brain areas and auditory cortex in a separate group of fMRI participants, where MPFC showed the best matches to the behavioral boundaries. I also showed that the boundary structure was preserved in these brain areas even after removing acoustic features, although to a lesser extent than when these features were not removed. Furthermore, right auditory cortex and MPFC were most impervious to this control, suggesting that event boundaries in these areas are driven by more high-level information, such as narrative and/or emotional shifts in the excerpts. Next, we showed that auditory cortex, precuneus, and angular gyrus preferred to represent events of a similar duration from around 10 to 20 seconds, while MPFC preferred to represent longer events than these three brain areas, ranging from around 15 to 60 seconds. To conclude, overall, our results point to a shared neural mechanism underlying event processing in music and other narrative-based stimuli, such as movies and stories. In future work, we plan to use more complex models such as deep neural networks to produce acoustic features that may better explain the event structure found in higher order brain areas. And finally, future work can be done to better understand how music event processing develops early in life, how it translates across cultures and across different levels of musical expertise. And with that, I would like to say thank you to all my funding sources and my labs, and thank you for listening. And I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has any. Thanks.